guy at 6 feet up. They actually don't let me talk about time or money, so you won't hear any of that here. And I have been doing plone for a long time. I started in 1998 doing ZOP work, and then later strictly CMF work, which is actually what plone is built on top of. In 2003, we went to the very first plone conference in NOLA, and that's where we got introduced to plone. And we've pretty much been doing plone ever since then, and speaking at all kinds of conferences, not just plone conferences, but other web-related conferences. So let's get down to it. Plone's anatomy, we're going to talk about things like the OFS, the CMF, the plone, some example deployment parts. I hope you won't get too scared by the gory details, hence the suggested R rating. I don't think it'll get too gory, so those of the weak at heart, you should be safe. What we're going to talk about now is I want to introduce the whole, not the whole stack, that would be about 5 days of talk, but a quick overview of the stack of products that make up the plone as we know it today. Plone is not just a single island of code. It's built in many layers. You know, it's a ready-to-run, out-of-the-box content management system. I think you've heard a lot of talk about the product versus framework discussion. Portions of it are very out-of-the-box. So I think that sometimes it fits more that ready-to-use, out-of-the-box, I can start managing content right away. But what happens when you need to go and customize it? So it provides for a framework for building extensible, products to build upon this content management framework that's already there for you. What's nice now is we've got the new ZOP 3 technologies, and we've got things like plone.app now as a product where we've got plone namespace things for reusable code that you could actually take in other places. So plone actually runs inside of the ZOP application server. Portions of plone, like I said, are very reusable. For instance, like plone.memoize is fully usable in like ZOP 3 or Grok only applications. So you're not limited to just using these things inside of plone. So not only are you going to learn more about how to do more things inside of plone, but how to take some of those plone components and leverage them in some of those other technologies that I think Martin just talked about in his previous talk. Plone sits directly on top of the content management framework. That's the original basis for plone. Originally, plone was just kind of a thin skin on top of the CMF, because the CMF isn't very pretty. No offense, Trace, but I think he knows that. And it used to actually be called the Portal Toolkit. We're going to dive into some of the components of CMF and see where a lot of the things that you see in everyday plone work come from. What all this sits on top of is the OFS package, which is the object file system. So let's start there. At the bottom of this stack I've got on the picture right here is with OFS. So what is the OFS? The OFS is the object file system. It provides a lot of kind of base classes for basically managing things as if you were looking at a file system, like a standard file system today. You go into your Finder or your Windows Explorer, you've got folders and you've got documents and you've got images and files. OFS is very similar. It provides a lot of interfaces to help define how these things interact with one another. The iApplication interface is the top-level system object. So if you actually fire up your ZOP debugger and do like a ZOPCTL debug, the very first line it says is app is your root object. That's actually an iApplication object, and it has an interface and it provides all kinds of different things you can do with it. So here's an example of what's actually in that directory. You'll see here I'm in my ZOP home /lib/OFS or Python/OFS. Inside of here you can see all the Python classes where we've got things like files, folders, image, concrete things you can open up, look at, see how they act and react. The important thing here is you may want to check out things like the interfaces files. Now, for people who aren't familiar with object-oriented programming, interfaces are basically a contract that code says if I implement this interface, I'm going to agree to provide these methods and properties on my objects to fulfill this contract. So if you're messing with anything, you can always be guaranteed that the methods that are on an interface are always going to be in those objects. Some of the interfaces that are provided are some folderish interfaces. So it provides things like a copy container or an ordered container, object managers, folders, FTP access, ordered folders. So very containers type things for holding objects. Now we're not talking about plone yet. This is strictly ZOP stuff. So you're talking about holding Pythonic type content objects that are just like pages or ZPT documents, or when you go into ZMI and the add menu, all those things inside of there can be placed inside of folders, or they could be folders themselves. Next thing you've got is object-ish, which are things that can go inside of those containers. So they implement interfaces like a copy source. So when you go and do a copy-paste from the plone menus through the plone UI, you're actually using like the copy source interface. It provides you methods for how to copy and paste items inside of the OFS. Interface for item, those are the core, the root interface that anything that wants to live inside the OFS has to implement. Looking at things with item with name, a manageable simple item, which is actually a kind of a mix-in class. I know you may have heard that term as you're going through this open plone world of mix-ins. Basically, mix-ins take a couple concrete class or implementations, mix them in together so that you get things like item with persistence, and that allows you to store things in the ZODB transparently without having to do anything about it. Object-ish interfaces also provide find support. So if you're in a ZMI and you've got the find tab, the implementing of the find support interface allows other objects to be found through that find tab. It's not the same thing as the portal catalog, which we'll get to later down the stack when we're talking about CMF and plone itself. Property management, which are the property sheets. If you click in the ZMI and you've got the properties tab, that's where that comes from, is the iProperty Manager tab. Traversable, which is what allows you to, using a URL to go to like folder A / folder B / folder C, you're actually traversing each item in that path, and iTraversable is the interface that allows for that to happen. You can actually do things like create your own adapters for iTraversable on your objects and alter the behavior of that traversal to meet your will, basically. So I'll give you a short example here. Here's iTraversable, like I was saying. So iTraversable, this is the interface. Anything that is iTraversable will always provide you with an absolute under URL method. You'll also have an absolute URL path method. You're guaranteed those things are going to be there. Anything that's in the OFS and anything that can be traversed through a URL has to implement this interface. And that's just how things work. Let me get a glass of water real quick. Some of the other interesting bits inside of the OFS are events. You may have heard a lot about the ZOP3 event models. We've got things that they're different. Each level provides its own set of events that get fired at various times. It's very similar to the DOM style events that you're going to see when you're dealing with, say, front-end UI browser development. You've got the same thing going on the back end. The OFS events that are going to be provided are things like object will be moved, object will be added, object will be removed, or the object's been cloned. And you can see these various events if you actually go into that OFS folder, look at the interfaces file that was in that folder. You'll see down at the very bottom they've got the various events all listed here. When you're actually dealing with an event, when the event gets fired, this one, for example, has certain attributes that are on the event that'll be available to you to use in your subscriber as you're listing for those events. You'll be guaranteed that these events are going to have things like the old name or new parent name. So those are the things you can actually access, manipulate, do bits with, go find new things, do all your event-based messing with it. So as we step up the stack, next step further, we're looking at the content management framework. And actually, if anybody has any questions along the way, please feel free. I know some of this is pretty deep stuff, and I'm just hoping I give you guys an overview of where to find these things, but feel free to ask a question at any point in time. So CMF provides the base tools that the plone is built upon. It provides a stable API to build your own products upon. So it's basically composed of a couple base packages, two of which are like CMF core and CMF default. Those things are defining the interfaces for tools, content, other events that are content management specific. CMF default contains some initial implementations of these CMF interfaces for you to use. And also some example implementations like CMF calendar. So if we look at, this is the CMF core interfaces right here. You're going to see that you've got a couple sets of files here. Oh shoot, the one right off the bottom. But these are a bit deprecated. If you actually open up any of these interface files right here, it's going to say this is now implemented by some other thing. There's actually only 3 files in there you really need to deal with. There's going to be the under content, under tools, and under events. And that's where the main interfaces are actually been re-implemented and kind of ZOAP 3 bridged in. So they're now ZOAP 3 interfaces instead of the old ZOAP 2 interfaces, which is what we originally started with the CMF. So if we're talking about the tools, it's things like the action icon tool, which is managing things like icons and print and email. CMF UID is providing tools like all things UID related. You've got the catalog tool. So all the various singletons you're going to find inside of your specific instance of plone, a lot of those are based off of original CMF tools. Here's an interface, for example, the membership tool. We're guaranteed the membership tool is going to have a method, set members folder by ID. Now, if we go into the content interface, we're going to be talking about all the content-ish type stuff. Yeah.
So the membership tool should be inside CMF core interfaces and core membership.py.
It should be inside the under tools.py inside the interfaces folder. If you're in CMF core interfaces, there's an under tools.py. That's where that's from. No problem. So when we're talking about content, we're talking about page, news item, file, image. So the interfaces for those kind of things are also found in that same folder in the under content.py file. It provides for getting a cooked body, which is like the rendered HTML that's going to show off to the screen, and getting the editable body, which is what's going to fall into the edit screen when you're editing that document you're on. Now there's various interfaces that typically the content object's not going to implement just one interface. If you actually go to the interfaces tab inside the ZMI, you'll see quite a list of interfaces that most objects inside your plone site are going to be implementing. Some of them from the CMF core level and some of them from further levels up. The CMF core is also providing us some new events that are specific to the CMF layer, mostly dealing with workflow. So the idea of workflow hadn't been introduced until CMF. We didn't have that in OFS. So inside of the workflow, we're going to have different kinds of events for workflow actions. Actions will be invoked, or actions raised, some exception. And these are various things that you can watch for these events and then react to them with your own subscribers. And you're also going to have, there again, some default attributes that are available on that event when it gets called. CMF also provides you with the CMF calendar package, which used to be a really good place to look for best practices. It was kind of the canonical CMF implementation of how you would do a third-party product or a plugin for CMF. It's still probably a pretty decent place to look at how a ZOAP 2 style product's been done in the past for CMF. This is without archetypes. This is just a straight Python code, no schema-based implementation. The Aztec calendar is probably not supported by CMF calendar. CMF also provides us the initial implementation of the topic, or is that smart folder, or wait, collection? Oh wait, that's basically the basis of the canned queries inside of plone. It's been called many names over the years. Currently it is collection. But I think, as Martin said, it's a very powerful aspect of plone, and I think it has a difficult to use UI, but there again it gives content administrators very powerful tools to use inside the site to create these aggregations or RSS feeds and pull items from many places. Because not only can you index items in your site in a catalog, you can index external items outside of your site inside the catalog using certain techniques, and you could actually pull those into a view using things like a topic. And the CMF also provided us with the DC workflow. So it's kind of been around forever, hasn't changed in a long time, and is rock solid, and I don't see much anything replacing it. DC workflow is going to give us our workflow definitions. It also has specific transition events in addition to those ones we saw from the CMF core. So here we can see the DC workflow. You've also got an events file inside of here with the implementation of those events, and it's going to have its own interfaces. Inside the interfaces file itself, we've got some additional transition events, and this has got a lot more attributes on it than the prior events we saw just coming with core. So this is layering on top yet again with more information and more attributes that are usable to you when these things get called. For example, like before transition or after transition. You used to do this inside of the workflow scripts themselves with a before script or an after script. You can actually hook that in now via a ZOP 3 subscriber instead of having it actually hardwired into your into those workflow definitions themselves. So now we move on to plone itself. This is, yeah.
Before we move on, the CMAP topic, where was that located? I couldn't find it.
It's going to be, are you using a build out?
Yeah, an omelet though.
Okay, it's not going to be in the omelet. It's not a ZOP 3 style product. It's going to be in your products directory.
It's going to be my product.
Yeah, like the CMF plone part, the plone part.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
No problem. So here we are at the top level of the stack. And plone is actually giving us a combination of ZOP 2 and new ZOP 3 components together. You're going to see a lot of different things. We're going to have different namespaces, and this is where, if you've got, like, for example, omelet installed in your build-out, you're going to see a plone namespace versus, like, say, plone.app namespace, and I think that raises a lot of confusion sometimes. Plone.app, our namespace items, are more tightly coupled into plone. They're basically what is plone. The plone.dot namespace without the app in there, those are packages that are intended to be reused across multiple frameworks if possible. Like I said, the memoize can be used anywhere else. I think plone.portlets is being used by Grok also. So those are components that you can get more traction with and not have to relearn new things as you take them across to other frameworks. So why don't we're going to look at an example here of how they relate to one another. So plone.app.layout, that's one of the ones that controls things like the global defines. If people have been doing plone since like 2.0 or 2.1, you had a global defines. A lot of those things have moved into a browser view inside of plone.app.layout. So you've got a lot of viewlets in there like byline, the global defines, which are now portal state. So if we look at portal state, this is inside of the plone.app.layout inside of portal.py. It's going to have a browser view for portal state, and it's going to provide you things like the old globals used to. So if you call portal, you get the portal object. You're actually going to be calling at portal state and getting the portal thing. You can see here, this is a plone.app namespace implementation. So this is core to plone working. This is actually leveraging one of the plone.dot namespace items, which is the memoize. So here it's actually using the memoize decorator so it can actually cache these values, so it doesn't have to recompute them as you go back and do a request after request after request. The importing of from plone.memoize.view gives you that. So if we put all these pieces together, we can look at basically what a deployment stack starts to look like. So we need to add in storage now. We haven't talked about below the OFS actually what's saving your items for you. We've got the ZODB, which is our object-oriented database that we store all of our objects inside of. And it actually originally started out as a persistent object system. So if you ever see a POS error, it's actually persistent object system, not something else. And originally ZOP used to be called Principia. To make that all transparent to the developer, there's another implementation in between the OFS and ZODB called persistent. Any object inside of ZOP that inherits from persistent, or any class that inherits from persistent, when you go to create that object and set it into a folder, it automatically gets stored away in the database for you. You don't have to do anything like call a transaction or commit or do any kind of sets. That's all kind of a black box, which is nice because you don't have to deal with object-oriented mapping or object relational mapping. That's all just taken care of for us. We get that for free. Now, if we want to take this to the next level and we want to cluster it, we're going to need to make that storage bit break out of the ZOP server so we can actually connect to it with multiple clients. So we actually take the ZODB portion of this, move it out into what's called a ZOP storage server. This is part of the whole ZOP Enterprise Objects, or ZO, setup. So once we moved it out into the outside of ZOP, we can add in multiple ZOP clients, which will all be identical. They're all running the same set of products. They look identical to one another. The only difference between them may actually be just the port number that they're running on and binding to. Otherwise, they can actually symlink to the exact same set of products. That way you're sure you're not missing something from an instance to another instance, because if you were, it wouldn't work very well. Now, how do you get everything to kind of play nicely and start serving up as if it's one cohesive site? We're going to put a load balancer in front like pound. And on top of that, we typically put something like Nginx to do like the rewriting. And in front of that, you can actually cluster squid if you really were so excited and wanted to do something like that. We've never actually had to do this, but it is possible. Squid has its own language to talk, between the different squids and check the caches and know what's going on between them. Then when you tie all these things together, it gets kind of messy, but it actually works out pretty well. You've got zRPC connections from the Zope clients going down into the Zio storage server using an internal communications language. But most of the other communication going on between the other components is typically HTTP, so it's pretty easy to debug as you're looking at transactions going across the wire. That's pretty much what I got. Here's the photo credits. And if you want to learn more, we'll be doing a 2-day event in November, the Plone Deployment Workshop. It'll be in Indy. We're actually going to have Alan come up to talk about more Windows-ish type stuff for our session, because we don't do a lot of that, but I think it should be really interesting and exciting. Anybody have any questions? I certainly didn't answer everybody's questions with this presentation.
Yourself, it would take 5 days to talk about the whole stack.
Well, it would. It's a very brief introduction to the stack. Steve.
I wonder if you'd like to cover the Zope 2 to Zope 3 sort of migration path. It's such a common source of misunderstanding.
Okay. Cover it. Well, so I think as we move through that stack of topics, most of the stuff I dealt with was Zope 2 related until we started getting into Plone, where we're talking about the namespace packages and using eggs for deploying. We've got the bridge between Zope 2 to Zope 3 called 5, which is a blessing and a curse sometimes. It can introduce some odd bugs and make it difficult to debug what's going on, but it's given us new things like browser views, viewlets, the whole portlet mechanisms. The whole new event system is all driven out of the Zope 3 components. So if you see ZCML files, those are all Zope 3 type things. That's how you wire those things together. That's where a lot of this, when I'm talking about interfaces, all the interfaces here I showed you were kind of a mixture. The OFS ones were all Zope 2 style interfaces. The Plone ones and some of the CMF ones were all Zope 3 style interfaces. There's nothing actually enforcing that an interface has to be actually implemented, by the interface, but it's just kind of a best practice, and it's how we've been hooking things up. So you could even use interfaces that didn't define any methods inside of them as marker interfaces to provide things like custom views on top of your objects. So I don't know if that covers how Zope 2, Zope 3 relates. The next releases of Plone are working towards eggifying Zope and eggifying the rest of the Plone stack, to move us basically out of the whole Zope 2 product space and get us into a good position to transition. I don't know if we're going to ever transition all the way to strictly Zope 3 or whatever Zope 3 may become. I think you're going to see more things like Grok coming into play for enabling it to be an easier story for developers to use Zope 3 technologies inside of Plone. Right now it can be tricky. I think anybody who saw Martin's talk, it was pretty well illustrated there that it's not as an easy task as it used to be to skin Plone. Anyone else? I hope everyone has figured out where they can find these things at least. It's kind of key you look at the interfaces files to understand, especially like finding events. I learned stuff putting this presentation together, scouring through those files about these various events I didn't know even existed.
All right, since you have time,
Yeah.
I'm going to be stupid. I can't find the ICMF topic. Can you go to the ICMF topic?
Wait, I'll do one better here.
I think you had it on a slide anyway.
I think I might actually be already in there. I'm an OFS.
So is this a build out?
This is what I've checked out right here is the Plone 3.1 like developer bundle. So for doing any kind of bug fixes, for example, every so often on Fridays, 6 Feet Up will be kind of putting on tune-up days where we want to go in and help people come on board and start fixing issues they may find in Plone or report issues. And we do this kind of our way of trying to get back into the community. So I've got what checked out here is what you would check out as a developer if you wanted to try out and test bugs or try and fix things. So I'm inside the root build out, I'm inside the products directory. Inside here we'll find CMF topic. Well, for you, it may be a little different on your build out. It's
Got the checkout too,
okay.
or a similar thing. I downloaded the product directory.
Okay, so it would have been in your parts, like plone. You're going to have the CMF topic directory. And inside of there is the interfaces folder. And here we're going to see we've got, actually, what you want to look at is the,
I got criteria.
yeah, so the under init inside of there actually is what contains iTopic. Got to make it a package. So this is where, this is the only method, I think the only method, no, is that right?
Query catalog.
So, did you find it?
I found it. We're on the same page, literally.
Okay, good.
On the same file.
So topics I said were canned queries. If you actually walk up to a topic object inside your plone and call query catalog and you don't pass it any arguments, it's going to go through all the criterions that you've defined or set up through, say, the plone interface, apply them to that query, and pass you back the results. That's the only thing a topic has to do. You can extend topics to do further things, but this is the only thing that we're required to do, and you know that anytime you go up to a topic, you're always going to be able to call this.
Out of curiosity, the things that like currently are available for collections, you're trying to, you can't really do a secret query like a not statement.
Right.
Is that something that might be possible in the future? Can we extend that far?
I'm not sure on that. That's kind of like a roadmap, type question that I'm probably more involved in implementations and integrations, and like I said, I'm almost more interested in doing tune-up days than I am in trying to like implement new features because we want to make sure that Plone has as few bugs as possible.
Does Advanced Query have a not?
Yeah, it does. I mean, Plone does include advanced query, but I don't think that the topic exposes any kind of interface to access it. Now, you can layer on multiple topics by nesting them.
Sorry, what did you say?
You could layer on multiple topics by nesting them, or you could have you can refine the queries as you put a topic inside of a topic inside of a topic.
Yeah, but then not, you can't have two topics
And get the intersection? No.
No,
No, it's just inherits from
You need-
the parent.
You need the extended query or advanced query.
Advanced query.
Yes. Is there some plan of like extending topic to do such things? They're
Like I said, not that-
really, I use them pretty often actually.
Yeah, like I said, they're very powerful, and I don't know much plans in the works. There's a whole set of plips out there, and if you're really interested in sponsoring some kind of advanced functionality like that, that would be the place you would find if they're going to do that. If there's any talk of it, it should be a plip.
Actually, you think that it can do this because you have these, in the criteria you have the and or section, so the user
Right.
interface is not perfect. You think you can, the and refers to the next criteria, which
Right.
it doesn't at all.
Mm-hmm.
So if it would,
Right.
you'd have exactly what you want. You can do anything with it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the reason I think that you could use advanced query here is the only thing this is doing is assembling all the criteria and creating a query statement actually to pass right into the catalog tool. It just passes right through after applying all the various filters it finds along the way of your criterions that you've set up in the folder. Oh. Yep.
I have a really bad memory, but Joel Burton in his boot camp talks about an index, a special index product that you can download that has that kind of functionality in it. I can't remember the name of it.
Oh.
Open to Joel Burton and ask him that question. He can answer it.
So what the comment was is we think that Joel Burton has mentioned in his classes before a special index you can use in the catalog to give you the not functionality or the or functionality.
I don't want to say totally for sure, but I'm pretty sure that he did something like that in the last boot camp where he installed a special index, and I didn't pay attention because it didn't interest me at the time, so I don't remember what it's called.
So see Joel Burton, it's his fault.
See Joel and ask him this question. All I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Do you, my experience in walking through the stack, which is enormous amounts of place to wander about, is using Eclipse and the PyDiff extensions. Do you and the go-to source, go-to definition function? Do you use that too, or do you propose using that for making it easier to find stuff? Because people ask me, where is this?
Where are these
Easy,
things?
One click, you find it. You find it.
I've actually never used Eclipse. I use TextMate. And TextMate has a grep through project, and if you have Omelette installed, primarily the things that I'm interested in are mostly going to be in the plone eggs layer, the newer stuff, all the Zope 3 style technologies, and so it'll search through those things. I don't have it's not really an IDE, so I don't have a fully integrated environment where I get auto completion or one-click kind of definitions to the code. The reason I went over the specific things in the Zope level, like the OFS, is just because everything is built on top of that. There's a lot of packages inside of the Zope 2, like page templates and the catalog and Z catalog and things like that. But you're not going to care so much about those because you're typically interested in building content or manipulating the content after, say, an event's happened, like a workflow change, or the object's been deleted or moved someplace. So I think a lot of people don't understand where they can find those events and how they know what events they can hook into, how they know what the attributes are going to be on the event when it gets handed to you. And those are all documented pretty well in the interfaces, which is a poor place for documentation, in my honest opinion. But at least now I'm hoping you know where it's at. I don't have time to go write a book about it, and that book would probably be out of date next month anyway.
So other than inside of, say, if you've got Omelette, you've got plone.app.layout and plone.app.portlets.
Yeah.
Where would you normally spend your time other than those two areas? Are there two areas?
Plone.app.content is another good one. If you want to make, for instance, archetypes is pretty heavy-handed as far as its footprint in the system. It'll bloat your catalog, it'll bloat the ZODB, and it's just got a lot of overhead because it provides you a lot of things out of the box that make it easy to use and create your own content types. If you wanted to make a lighter weight piece of content, there's some tools inside of plone.app.content that allow you to create a schema, like a Zope 3 schema-based content object that doesn't have all the archetypes overhead. No archetypes dances as it gets serialized down in the catalog and things like that. No, it's using, you would create your own base content objects. These would be new objects, not extended objects already in the system. And the current development we've been doing, we try and use more and more things like schema extender and not create custom content objects unless we have to. Typically things are publishing and it's pages and news, and if we only needed to add on a few extra fields, it's going to make migrating simpler because you don't have to worry about these custom content types kind of coming along for the ride. So the more you can leverage what's already given to you out of the box, the better off you're going to be as far as moving from version to version. Because then you're kind of then being dependent on also third-party packages. All come in varying qualities of code, and so sometimes you may be better off actually just doing the thing you want more simply. You don't need all the features of, say, some third-party package. I'd recommend doing it yourself from scratch. Anyone else? Or is everyone still diving in the code? Yeah.
So, obviously, if I put a syntax error inside one of my scripts or classes, which rarely happens, we'll see the trace back where you can see where the start, the very start. The start is publisher, and goes down. So, could you give a kind of view of what happens? Basically, when, as I understand it, when we request a page,
Mm-hmm.
where basically it's using traversal to find an object and then call the call method.
Right.
Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess I think I might have had this conversation with someone about where is main, and main is actually inside the loop of Zope.
Right.
Waiting for requests.
Yeah.
It's just
That's the publisher.
any kind of like Apache or any kind of daemon type system. And so it's doing a listen.
Right.
But when it catches on to the I'll just make the question is can you kind of give an overview of what's happening when it hits from traversal down to the call and then to your object? So imagine a very simple browser view. It
Right.
And so what's actually happening from once your computer receives the request on port 8080?
Well, they say it's going to come in through the publisher. I'm by no means a complete ZOP expert, but what happens is it's going to go through, and like I said, traverse down through each object, calling the traversal. If the object implements traversal, it's going to use those methods to figure out how to find the next thing below. The typical standard traversal is just going to look for an object ID inside of the container with the same ID of the thing that's in the next part of the URL. You can do things like setting up fake traversals where you implement your own traversal adapter. So you implement iTraversal, make an adapter for, say, your piece of content. You could actually have it hook in there, catch, like, say, for example, you wanted to do, for blogging is a good example. If you've got a weblog and you want to have archives by date, like 2008, 05, 31, that's the object. You could do that with this custom traversal attributes or a adapter. You wouldn't actually need to have a folder for 2008, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You would just basically fake it in with the traversal adapters to give you that functionality you want. So as it comes in, it's going to look up those traversal adapters, figure out how to find the next objects. When it gets down to the base of the end of traversal, if you had like an at view at the end of it, it's going to look up the adapter, because views are actually just adapters. They're multi-adapters that take the request and the interface, look up what view class to put on top of it, go get it, and then render it. The view class then calls into your model, which is your piece of content, and sitting inside the ZODB to look up the data to put into the view. It actually brings up an interesting point. I mentioned that 5 can be kind of unwieldy sometimes. If you have, for example, an attribute error in your view class, it will not throw an attribute error exception when you hit it. You're going to get an unauthorized, I think. It's strange because it's not what you're expecting. If you're working on the code, you would expect some kind of like attribute error, for example. The best way to debug those type of 5 errors is to actually go into it's not found. Instead of attribute error, you're going to get a not found exception. You're going to want to go into the Z publisher, find that where it raises not found, and put your PDB trace right there. When you go to do a trace, at that point you'll hit that not found. Then you can actually go in and actually call the get multi adapter on the object in question with the view name. And at that point, it's going to return you actually what the real error is, which typically is something like an attribute error. So 5 can mask a lot of ZOP 3 exceptions, kind of confusingly so. So if you're really unsure about things, you can always, especially if it's raising a not found and it doesn't make sense, the publisher is a good place to actually go in and throw a trace. I didn't come up with that one on my own. Philip helped me with it. Philip von Wiederhausen helped me with that one.
I've been looked at publisher.py.
Yeah.
And how long is that file?
It's pretty long, but it's only going to have 2 instances of not found.
Okay.
I know this by heart. Do you have a question right here?
Well, I was going to ask where the publisher file is.
That's going to be in your ZOP home. It's going to be in Z publisher? No. Or ZOP. Yeah, Z publisher, sorry. So it's in the publish, actually HTTP request. Okay, HTTP response.
That's in Z server, Z publisher.
So it's actually this one right here, I believe. Oh, that was a debug error one. So if you're in debug mode, it's going to hit this point right here when you get that not found coming from a 5, basically a 5 exception. that's where you're going to want to set your right above this, you're going to want to set your trace, and from there you can debug it further. I think that's about it. I want to thank you all. Have a great conference.